I'd known Harold for years. As my neighbor, he'd been there through every season: the backyard gatherings, the snowed-in winters, and the endless renovations I swore I'd finish someday. He was a steady presence, a retired professor with a knack for storytelling and an impressive wine collection he loved to boast about. My husband and I had shared many quiet evenings listening to his stories, glasses of Cabernet in hand, as he wove tales from his days teaching philosophy. But it was different now. My husband had been away on business for months, and somehow Harold had become more than just our neighbor. He'd become a friend, someone I could rely on when the house felt just a little too empty. One evening, after a long day of work, I decided to unwind with a glass of wine. The cellar was cool and quiet, the dim light casting a soft glow across the rows of bottles. I savored the calm, running my fingers along the dusty labels as I searched for a favorite vintage. It was then that I heard the faint creak of the cellar door, followed by Harold's familiar voice calling my name. "Amelia," he called out softly, as if hesitant to disturb me. I turned, surprised to see him there, his tall frame framed by the doorway, hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. "Harold, I didn't expect you," I said, trying to ignore the sudden flutter in my chest. "I saw the light on and thought I'd stop by," he replied, his eyes scanning the shelves before resting on me. "Hope I'm not interrupting." "No, not at all," I replied, a smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. "I was just choosing a bottle. Care to join me?" He hesitated, but then nodded, stepping further into the room. His eyes lingered on the selection, eventually picking up a bottle of Merlot with a quiet approval. "You've got good taste," he murmured, a hint of admiration in his voice. He held the bottle up, examining the label before handing it to me. As our fingers brushed, a spark jolted through me, startling in its intensity. I quickly pulled my hand back, hoping he hadn't noticed. But when I glanced up, his eyes were fixed on mine, a subtle warmth in them that felt different, almost too intense. He cleared his throat, breaking the moment, and reached for the corkscrew. "Shall we open it?" he asked, his tone casual, but I could see something else lingering in his gaze, something that sent a shiver down my spine. "Yes," I managed to say, trying to steady my voice. I busied myself with the glasses, feeling the weight of his presence beside me as he worked the cork from the bottle. There was something different about tonight, something charged in the air between us. As the cork slid free with a soft pop, the rich scent of the Merlot filled the cellar, mingling with the cool, earthy smell of the stone walls. I handed him a glass, our fingers brushing again, and this time the contact lingered just a fraction too long, enough to send another thrill racing up my arm. I could feel my pulse quicken, the silence around us thick with unspoken words. We clinked our glasses, his eyes never leaving mine as he murmured, "To good neighbors," his voice soft, almost reverent. I echoed his words, the glass cool in my hand as I took a long sip, letting the warmth of the wine spread through me, steadying me. But it did little to quiet the growing tension between us, the way his gaze held mine, as if searching for something neither of us could name. As I set my glass down, he moved closer, his presence filling the small space, leaving only inches between us. I could feel the heat radiating from him, the subtle scent of his cologne blending with the wine. My heart pounded in my chest, a mix of anticipation and uncertainty. This was Harold, my steady, dependable neighbor, but tonight, there was a different energy, an intensity that seemed to bridge the years between us. "You know," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, "I never expected to find myself here, sharing a moment like this." I looked up at him, the words catching in my throat. "Neither did I," I replied, my voice softer than I intended, laced with a vulnerability I couldn't hide. His hand reached out, almost instinctively, brushing a stray strand of hair from my face, his fingers lingering just a beat too long. His touch was gentle, deliberate, and in that brief moment, it felt as though time had stopped, as though we were the only two people in the world. I could see the hesitation in his eyes, the silent question, and before I could think, I found myself leaning into his touch, my heart racing as his hand settled on my cheek, warm and reassuring. "Amelia," he murmured, my name falling from his lips with a softness that sent a shiver down my spine. His thumb traced a gentle line along my cheek, his gaze intense, searching, as if trying to read the thoughts running through my mind. I couldn't look away, drawn in by the quiet strength in his eyes, the depth of emotion that seemed to linger just beneath the surface. Without thinking, I reached up, my hand covering his, holding it against my cheek as I closed my eyes, letting myself savor the warmth, the intimacy of the moment. It felt like crossing an invisible boundary, stepping into a place we both knew we shouldn't go, yet neither of us could pull away. When I opened my eyes, he was still there, his face inches from mine, his expression filled with a tenderness that took my breath away. "Amelia, if this is too much." "No," I whispered, cutting him off, my voice barely audible. "I don't want you to stop." The words left my lips before I could second guess them, a quiet plea that seemed to break the last of his restraint. His hand moved to my waist, pulling me closer, and in that instant it felt as though the walls around us disappeared, leaving only the two of us in a world of our own making. His lips brushed mine, tentative, almost hesitant, as if testing the boundaries of what was real. But as our lips met, any doubts melted away, replaced by a surge of warmth, of longing that had been buried, unspoken, until now. I leaned into him, letting myself get lost in the moment, in the quiet intensity of his kiss, the way his arms wrapped around me, steady and sure, grounding me as the world spun around us. Every touch, every brush of his hand against my skin felt like a revelation, an awakening of something I hadn't realized I was missing. His fingers trailed along my back, pulling me closer, and I could feel his heart beat against mine, fast and unsteady, mirroring the rhythm of my own. It was as if we were discovering each other for the first time, exploring the depths of a connection that defied explanation, that felt both foreign and profoundly right. He pulled back, his gaze searching mine, his hand lingering on my cheek. "I don't want to rush this," he murmured, his voice filled with a quiet intensity. "But I can't deny what I feel, not anymore." I looked up at him, my heart swelling with a mix of emotions that left me breathless. "Neither can I," I replied, my voice trembling, filled with a vulnerability I hadn't expected. We stayed like that, caught in the quiet intimacy of the moment, each of us unwilling to break the spell that had woven itself around us. The air was thick with unspoken promises, with the weight of emotions we hadn't yet dared to voice. And in that silence, I felt a sense of peace, a sense of belonging that I hadn't felt in a long time. His fingers traced gentle patterns along my back, each touch sending a wave of warmth through me. We stood there in the dim glow of the cellar, wrapped in an unspoken understanding, as though the world outside had ceased to exist, leaving only the two of us bound by this shared moment. The scent of the wine mingled with the subtle notes of his cologne, creating a heady mixture that left me feeling lightheaded, as if I'd been swept up in a dream from which I didn't want to wake. As he held me, his hands resting at the small of my back, I felt his hesitation, the quiet restraint in his touch. It was as though he, too, was caught in the same whirlwind of emotions, both of us aware of the boundaries we were crossing, the line that was fading into something indistinct and fragile. His hand slid up, fingers threading through my hair as he looked down at me, his expression filled with a tenderness that left me breathless. "Amelia," he whispered, my name lingering on his lips, as though it held 1,000 meanings. His gaze searched mine, filled with questions, with a silent yearning that mirrored my own. I could feel the weight of his emotions, the depth of his struggle, and yet there was something undeniable between us, a connection that felt as though it had been waiting to surface, hidden beneath layers of propriety and time. I reached up, my fingers tracing along the line of his jaw, feeling the faint roughness of stubble beneath my touch. He closed his eyes at the contact, leaning into my hand, and in that moment, I felt as though I had glimpsed a part of him he rarely showed, a vulnerability, a quiet longing that made my heart ache. "Harold," I murmured, the word barely more than a breath, yet it seemed to break the last of the tension between us. His eyes opened, filled with a quiet intensity, and before I could think, he leaned down, his lips capturing mine in a kiss that was slow, unhurried, yet filled with a passion that had been carefully restrained until now. The world around us seemed to fade away, leaving only the warmth of his embrace, the gentle pressure of his hands as they moved along my back, pulling me closer. Our breaths mingled, the quiet sound of our heartbeats filling the space between us, and I felt myself surrendering to the moment, letting go of everything but the feel of his touch, the taste of his kiss. His fingers trailed along my spine, sending a shiver through me as his lips moved with a tenderness that was both exhilarating and grounding. As the kiss deepened, I felt his hands move to cradle my face, his thumbs brushing softly along my cheeks, grounding me, anchoring me in a way that made my heart swell with an overwhelming sense of closeness. Each touch, each caress felt deliberate, filled with a quiet reverence that left me feeling cherished, as though he were discovering a part of me I hadn't known existed. We broke apart, breathless, our foreheads resting against each other as we struggled to catch our breath. His hands remained on my face, his thumbs tracing gentle circles along my cheeks, and I could feel his pulse racing, mirroring the frantic beat of my own heart. "This feels different," he murmured, his voice filled with a quiet awe, as though he, too, was caught off guard by the intensity of what had just happened. His gaze held mine, filled with a depth of emotion that left me feeling exposed, vulnerable in a way I hadn't anticipated. "It does," I whispered back, my voice trembling. I could feel the weight of his emotions, the quiet vulnerability in his touch, and it made me want to hold on to him, to reassure him in a way that went beyond words. I reached up, covering his hands with mine, grounding myself in the warmth of his touch, the steady presence of him beside me. He pulled me into his arms, wrapping me in a gentle embrace, and I rested my head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. It was a sound that was both soothing and thrilling, a reminder of the intimacy we had just shared, the closeness that had blossomed between us in the quiet moments of the night. His hands moved in slow, comforting circles along my back, grounding me, anchoring me in a way that left me feeling safe, cherished. "Amelia," he murmured, his voice barely more than a whisper. He pulled back slightly, his hands resting on my shoulders, as he looked down at me, his gaze filled with a tenderness that left me breathless. "I don't want this to be something fleeting." I looked up at him, my heart swelling with a mixture of emotions: gratitude, hope, and a quiet certainty that this moment, this connection, was something rare and precious. "Neither do I," I replied, my voice barely more than a whisper, but filled with a conviction that surprised even me. We stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, each of us lost in our own thoughts, yet bound by a shared understanding that went beyond words. The silence between us was filled with unspoken promises, a quiet determination to hold on to what we had found, no matter the challenges that lay ahead. As the night wore on, we found ourselves sitting together in the cellar, our conversation flowing easily, each word a quiet reassurance, a reminder of the connection that had blossomed between us. We spoke of memories, of dreams and fears, sharing parts of ourselves that we had long kept hidden, and with each passing moment, I felt our bond deepening, growing stronger, more certain. Hours passed, and the first light of dawn began to filter through the small window above, casting a soft, golden glow over the room. We sat in comfortable silence, his hand resting on mine, our fingers intertwined as we watched the world slowly come to life. In that quiet moment, I knew that whatever happened, this night would remain etched in my memory, a reminder of the courage it took to let someone in, to open my heart to the possibility of love, even when it came in the most unexpected way. As the first rays of sunlight crept into the cellar, casting warm light across his face, I couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness, mixed with the overwhelming warmth of the night we had shared. It felt as though dawn was breaking into the sanctuary we had created together, a reminder that the outside world still existed, that this bubble of intimacy would soon have to yield to reality. Harold's hand tightened slightly around mine, as if sensing the shift in my mood. He looked at me, his eyes soft but filled with the same questions I felt lingering within me. "Are you all right?" he asked gently, his thumb brushing small, soothing circles over the back of my hand. I nodded, a faint smile touching my lips. "I am." My words faltered as I tried to gather my thoughts. How could I express the depth of what I felt, the strange blend of peace and trepidation that came with realizing we had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed? "It feels surreal," I finally managed, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, a quiet understanding in his eyes. "It does," he agreed softly, his gaze never wavering. "But I don't regret a single moment." The sincerity in his voice, the quiet strength with which he spoke, sent a warmth through me that settled in my chest, anchoring me to the present, to him. We sat in silence for a while, his hand still holding mine, our breaths in sync as the golden light washed over us. The world outside was waking, yet here, in this hidden space, it felt as though time had paused, granting us a few precious moments more. Eventually, he pulled me into a gentle embrace, his arms wrapping around me with a tenderness that left me breathless. His hand traced along my back, slow and steady, grounding me, reassuring me in a way words couldn't. I leaned into him, feeling the steady beat of his heart against mine. And for a moment, the worries, the doubts, the complexities of what lay ahead faded into the background. After a while, he leaned back, his hands resting on my shoulders as he looked at me, his expression filled with quiet determination. "I want you to know that whatever happens, I'm here," he said softly, his voice filled with a depth of emotion that made my heart swell. "I don't know where this will lead us, but I know that I don't want to face it alone." His words struck a chord deep within me, resonating with a quiet truth I hadn't dared to admit to myself. This wasn't just a fleeting moment or a passing impulse. What we shared was real, grounded in something that had grown quietly between us, hidden beneath the surface, until now. "I feel the same way," I replied, my voice trembling with the weight of everything I wanted to say. "I don't know what the future holds, but I want to face it with you." A faint smile touched his lips, his eyes filled with a warmth that left me feeling cherished, seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. He reached up, his hand cradling my face as he leaned down, his lips brushing mine in a kiss that was soft, tender, filled with a quiet reverence. It was a promise, unspoken yet undeniable, a pledge to hold on to what we had found, no matter the challenges that lay ahead. As we finally pulled apart, he took my hand, helping me to my feet, and we made our way back up the stairs. Stepping into the early morning light, the house was quiet, filled with the gentle sounds of dawn, and I felt a sense of peace settle over me, a quiet certainty that whatever lay ahead, we would face it together. In the days that followed, we navigated our new reality with caution, mindful of the boundaries we had crossed, yet determined to hold on to the connection we had found. Our moments together were quiet, stolen glances and lingering touches that spoke of the depth of our bond, the unspoken promise that had formed between us. There was a sense of quiet joy in each interaction, a feeling of belonging that transcended words, filling the spaces between us with a warmth that was both comforting and thrilling. Yet, beneath the surface, there lingered a quiet tension, a subtle awareness of the challenges that lay ahead. We were both aware of the risks, the uncharted waters we were venturing into, yet neither of us was willing to let go, to turn back now. One evening, as we sat together on his back porch, watching the sun set over the horizon, he reached for my hand, his gaze steady, filled with a quiet resolve. "I've spent so much of my life waiting," he said softly, his voice tinged with a vulnerability that made my chest tighten, waiting for something that felt real, something that made me feel alive. He looked down at our hands, his thumb brushing softly over my knuckles. "And then you came along, and suddenly, everything felt different. I don't want to let that go." His words touched something deep within me, a part of me that had longed for connection, for understanding, for a love that transcended the ordinary. I squeezed his hand, my voice filled with a quiet conviction as I replied, I don't want to let it go either, Harold. Whatever this is, it feels right. It feels like something worth holding on to. We sat there, wrapped in the quiet intimacy of the moment, our hands intertwined as we watched the last rays of sunlight fade into twilight. It was a simple moment, yet it felt profound, a silent pledge to face whatever lay ahead, to hold on to each other in the face of uncertainty. As the weeks turned into months, our bond grew stronger, deepening with each shared moment, each quiet confession, each unspoken promise. We built a life together in the quiet spaces of our shared existence, a world that was ours alone, hidden from the prying eyes of the outside world. But even as we carved out a sanctuary within the walls of our homes, we knew that the world beyond would eventually intrude, that the reality of our situation would demand answers, decisions, choices we couldn't avoid forever. One evening, as we sat together in the quiet of his living room, he turned to me, his gaze steady, filled with a quiet determination that left me breathless. I don't want to keep hiding, he said softly, his voice tinged with a mix of hope and fear. I want to be able to hold your hand in public, to share this part of my life with the people who matter to me. His words struck a chord within me, echoing the very thoughts I had wrestled with in the quiet hours of the night. I looked at him, my heart swelling with a mixture of love and gratitude as I replied, I want that too, Harold. I want us to be able to live openly, without fear, without having to hide. We sat in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts, yet bound by a shared understanding, a quiet resolve to face the world together, come what may. In the days that followed, we took small steps, gradually revealing our relationship to those closest to us, each step a quiet triumph, a testament to the strength of our bond. And though there were challenges, moments of doubt, we held on to each other, finding strength in the love we had built, a connection that had grown quietly, yet unbreakable in its resolve. As we stood together, hand in hand, facing the uncertain path ahead, I knew that whatever happened, we would face it together, bound by a love that was rare, beautiful, and wholly ours.